be doing a little work on a national triolean today. This is the main axe for a local performer. It's nice. A lot of my pro clients are starting to pick up gigs again, and there's a real sense of excitement that comes along with that. But there's also the need for some tune-ups for their gear. Everyone and their brother wants to get their stuff roadworthy at the same time. So, pretty busy. We need to take these things up a notch for on-stage use. This thing is in pretty good shape, considering how much it gets used and its age. It's from 2009. That was 12 years ago, folks. There's another one of a similar vintage coming in for a refret in a couple of weeks that you won't believe when you see it, because it legitimately looks 85 years old. In fact, I've seen 85-year-old ones that were less worn. This has got just a little bit of paint loss in a couple of areas, pick wear, that kind of thing. There was a period in the mid-2000s when National seems to have gone through some paint problems, adhesion problems. It would crack and fall off unprovoked. Seen that on a couple of guitars. This thing, I think we put a new set of tuners on it about 5 or 6 years ago, but it's doing very well for itself. The issue is a buzz. The player thought at first that maybe he'd worn through the maple saddle a little bit too much on his third string here, which happens to be an F sharp rather than G. That seemed unlikely to me when I read it, because the action on this instrument is around 3/32, 6/64, 95 thousandths, 2.4 millimeters, take your pick, which is pretty standard for a National. It's a little on the high side. With a biscuit bridge and the tailpiece they use, it's difficult to get them to go too much lower than that without reducing the necessary pressure on the cone. If you take the action too low, they start to sound very unfocused. So, you know, they're designed to have a medium-high action, which makes it really unlikely that you're going to get fret buzz from a slightly worn saddle slot. And that buzz is really only there when I play the string open, which is pretty much a dead giveaway that the nut slot that it's sitting in has worn too low. There isn't enough clearance over the first fret. Just looking at the rest of the strings, I can also see that the 5th string is sitting right on top of the fret as well. And that means this one is probably very close to starting to buzz too. Oh, there we go. Especially if you play hard, and this player uses a thumb pick for his downstrokes. Interestingly, the 1st and 2nd strings seem to have reasonable clearance. But that's because the fret has worn down at the same rate as the nut slots. This happens differently for different players. I'm going to recrown these and get rid of the flat spots, and I'm not going to reduce the height, but I will make them more round. They still play pretty cleanly, and they're not too low. Again, that could vary depending on the action settings. If we gave this thing a neck reset and the action came down to, I don't know, 4 or 5/64 rather than 6, these might very well be too low at that point, and I would have to dress all of the frets past them to bring them in line. So this is a classic chain of dominoes that happens when you start thinking about guitar repairs. Make one little change and it can affect everything else. So with regards to the nut, I could shim it or replace it. I wouldn't do the super glue and bone dust trick for this player. He uses open tunings, and he'll retune 3 or 4 times in the same set. So dragging this wound G string over the fill, it would not last too long for him. And he wants me to replace it. Because this is his favorite guitar, I'm going to have to be pretty careful about keeping the dimensions and the spacing the same so that when he picks it up again, he shouldn't notice a big difference. It should feel very familiar to him. National nuts have this odd profile that's very much their own. It's unlike Martin's or Gibson. I've mentioned this before. It's a sharp kind of fang-like shape, tapering up to the front edge. Like a shark's fin. It might be a good way to describe it. Take some preliminary measurements to see how far the strings are from the edge of the fingerboard for our future reference. National nuts aren't lacquered in place like some other manufacturers do, specifically Gibson during certain eras. However, depending how these were glued in, a little bit of adhesive might be sort of caught right in the corner there that could theoretically chip the lacquer away. So I'm just going to go around the edge here in the corner carefully with a knife. Here's an illustration of those adhesion issues I was talking about. I don't know if it'll really show up here, but the back edge of the nut, when I run my blade along, I can see that the paint back here is slightly bubbled, like it's not stuck down perfectly where that cut was made. So if I don't slice it back here and I go ahead and I try to knock it free, a big chunk of paint could come loose. Okay, when I hit this, the force is going to be going down sort of diagonally and pivoting off the back edge of the nut. So hopefully it kind of rocks upwards and out rather than back, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to hit it as gently as I can, but it still takes enough force to make it move. Okay, came up pretty nicely. It was glued on the bottom of the nut. You can see we've lost some of the maple. The first thing I want to do is put a little super glue along that edge there to try and hold down the lacquer. The glue company sealed this one for someone's protection beyond their usual level of cognizance. Hey, you can see I've got a piece of plexiglass clamped lightly on the front surface here, holding down that bubble of air under the layer of paint. And it's far enough back that I'm not worried about getting glue in there that might get stuck. And I'm tipping the headstock angle downwards enough that the glue is going to run into that line. I'll take some basic measurements. National nuts are usually a little bit wider front to back than a lot of other manufacturers. You need to start with a blank that's a full 1/4 inch width. A lot of blanks these days come 6 millimeters, which is too narrow for this. So I only needed to remove about 4/1000ths from my blank. Polished it basically with some 400 grit paper. I marked the length from the old nut and sawed to the outside of the pencil line. That'll give me just enough to polish the ends, and it should come out to be the same length. I'm using micro mesh discs for this. They come in a range of extremely fine grits. The bottom of the nut slot is not perpendicular to the end of the fingerboard here, so I needed to sand some more to improve that angle. Got it fitting better. I'll use the half pencil to transfer the height of the frets to the face of the nut blank. I know that if I file down to the high side of that line, I should be pretty close to the correct depth, because the end of the graphite there is about 25/1000ths, 2.1 or 2 millimeters tall, so it acts like a kind of gauge. In this case, there isn't a whole lot of excess material to remove. If there was, I'd use a belt sander. But I make pretty quick work of it here with a sanding block, leaving like a 32nd of an inch extra. Using the original nut as a guide, I'll mark the centers of the outside string grooves. This is a way to make sure that they'll end up where I want them on the neck. To replicate the string-to-string spacing, I mark the centers of the grooves on the face of the old nut, so I can measure. These aren't equally spaced, so I'll check and see if they line up with the Stumac nut and saddle rule, which they do, which makes things very easy. One interesting thing to note, because of the slight radius on the top of the nut, the distance is elongated between those two outside strings, so I need to move over one set of hatch marks to compensate for that. After this, I'll rough in the string slots using nut files. So it's just to the line. This leaves a little extra for final fitting. Yeah, I know my hands are wrecked this week. It's what happens. I'll mark the profile and go outside to my cheesy little disc sander to get rid of most of the excess. Then I'll refine the shape using files. You don't want to breathe too much of this bone dust. Shell dust is even worse. Stuff from mother of pearl, that's not good for you. I'll knock off the corners and make them smooth. And then there's some sanding to do. I work my way up through all the grits, all the way up to like 8,000. I'm going to do some gentle recrowning. These are jumbo frets. They start off more than 50,000ths tall, And there's plenty of height there, so I could do a full fret dress from end to end, but in this case it's probably not warranted. I'll simply use the crowning file to re-radius those areas that have worn or flattened. This decreases the width of any divots there while retaining the full height of the fret. This player likes the tall frets. I'll polish until they shine. It's amazing what a difference that makes from a tactile standpoint. You can feel it. Just a little bit of glue on the end surface of the fingerboard. 2 drops will do it. You can see that this nut has a couple of mineral deposit spots running through it, which really didn't show up until later in the process, but such is life. It's a natural material. Going to use some of the John Pierce 13 to 57 strings today, so a little extra thickness for dropped D open tunings. And because of prior planning, the strings are only sitting just a hair high. That's a tip, maybe. If you leave lots of extra height on the nut that you have to file through, there's more chance you'll go off course in that filing and mess up the string spacing. Conversely, there's also less material you can correct with if you do happen to be offline, so it's a trade-off. Filing the little relief on the back side where the strings exit really helps prevent binding, especially with slot headstocks like this one. I polished the inside of the slot with some 1000 grit sandpaper and then put a little bit of regular pencil graphite in there, and that acts as a lubricant. And there we have it. That's a reasonable facsimile of a national style nut, a proper fang. It's after midnight. Gotta let it all hang out.